If you've ever been to a Sunday church service, chances are that you noticed the part where members are invited to give. In many denominations, this will include a short teaching and/or testimony about giving and/or tithing. Giving is not necessarily controversial, but Christians can be divided over the latter. Some say that tithing is only for the Old Testament. Others say it is still relevant for today, if not even binding. In this episode, we will survey tithing in the Bible, presenting a case for its benefit in principle, connecting aspects with the ways in which money and giving are spoken of in the New Testament more directly. The word tithe in the Old Testament is the Hebrew word ma'aseh, meaning 10th part. Specifically, in the context of giving, 10% of one's increase or profit. In terms of its requirement for Israel in the Mosaic Law, we have mentions in Leviticus 27, Numbers 18, and Deuteronomy chapters 12, 14, and 26. Leviticus 27 is mostly dealing with the matter of vows. In terms of the tithe, it speaks of how the tithe is not something one can use in meeting the demands of a vow, as it already belongs to God, and therefore not for any individual to use as they please. Hence the stipulation of how, if one is to transfer the produce of the land into money, he must add 1/5 to the tithe of this monetary increase, a 20% penalty, and how every 10th of one's livestock as they pass under the counting rod must be set apart. Numbers 18 focuses on the purpose of tithes as being the inheritance for the Levites, the tribe from which came the priesthood after Aaron. As they were not given their own territory, the tithes of Israel were used to at least support their livelihood so they could remain dedicated in their service to the nation in their priestly duties. Deuteronomy chapter 12 speaks of God's choice for where the tithes should ultimately be brought, which would be, of course, Jerusalem, where the temple would eventually be built, a place of his presence, where, in the process of this tithing event, they could rejoice before the Lord. Deuteronomy chapter 14 gives an exception. That is, if the journey is too long for taking 1/10 of their physical harvest or increase of their livestock, in which case one is meant to exchange it for money in order to travel light and make purchases upon arrival to still join in with the eating celebration component of the tithing process. It also speaks of how every third year, stored tithes for that year are to be brought out and used for the Levite, stranger, fatherless, and widow among them, that they may come and eat and be satisfied. And Deuteronomy chapter 26 goes into further detail, including the prayers involved in the third year of tithing. The extent of the seriousness of the tithe in the context of Old Covenant Israel is shown in the prophetic pronouncements of Malachi in the final book of the Old Testament. The prophecy is set against the returned exiles of Israel, who were once again failing to walk after the ways of Yahweh and keep his precepts, tithing included. Interestingly, the context includes the statement, "For I am the Lord, I do not change," and also follows the prophecy concerning the messenger who would prepare the way for the Messiah. And so, we will now look at the two mentions of tithing that the Messiah, Jesus, speaks of. One is found in Matthew chapter 23, verse 23, which reads, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. These you ought to have done, without leaving the others undone." Jesus' second recorded mention is in Luke chapter 18, verses 9 to 14, where a Pharisee character is set in contrast to a tax collector character. The Pharisee includes tithing as part of his list of deeds in order to elevate himself before God. So, at minimum, in both cases, we could see here that Jesus wasn't showing any clear indications of bringing an end to the practice of tithing. Instead, he uses tithing as one of the examples to show that purely ritualistic religious observances, in and of themselves, are not what demonstrate the righteousness of God. However, the difficulty with using these passages to support the idea that tithing is still meant to continue for the church, at least in a binding sense, is that A. This teaching is occurring pre-New Covenant still, and B is directed at or against the scribes and Pharisees in particular, i.e., those who were not followers of the teacher. Moreover, Jesus' pronouncements of woes in Matthew chapter 23 include other examples that did clearly cease with the change of covenants, such as the temple and altar. The only other direct mention of the tithe in the New Testament is found in Hebrews chapter 7 verses 1 through 10. Again, here the context isn't concerned with the specific matter of tithing per se, but rather the use of the historic example of Abraham's tithing to the king priest, Melchizedek, as part of the larger case in Hebrews for showing the supremacy of Christ as the great high eternal priest. That is, how Jesus' role as the king priest after the order of Melchizedek is far greater than the temporal Levitical priesthood of Israel within that period concerning the Old Covenant, the Abraham-Melchizedek event being outside these boundary markers. Consequently, some see tithing as transcending the law, continuing beyond Jesus' fulfillment of the law and on into the new covenant. While a logical idea, it seems strange that something so significant would nowhere else be spoken of in the New Testament scriptures. So, if out of the entire New Testament we have only 3 passages directly mentioning the tithe, and each are not really teaching anything about how Christians should tithe, one is then left with a question as to what is actually expected of Christians when it comes to their possessions and income. Thankfully, the answer to this is much more readily apparent. We will respond by focusing on key passages that share similar principles to those of the Old Testament tithe, which are 1. Providing for ministers, 2. Providing for fellow believers, and 3. Providing for others. 1. Providing for ministers. Providing for ministers was seen in its Old Testament context by the way in which the Levitical priesthood was supplied through Israel's tithe. This is paralleled to some degree in the following New Testament passages. Acts chapter 6 verses 1 through 4 shows the purpose of the choosing of the 7 for the distribution of aid to widows, being so that the apostles could give themselves continually to prayer and to the ministry of the word. The importance of being freed up for both continual prayer and continual word preparation and ministry implies that there was no time for working in their previous vocations, and thus they were probably being provided for out of the proceeds being laid at their feet. The passage then might serve as an initial basis for the notion of full-time vocational ministry that today we might see is catered for in part through tithing. Paul, in his first letter to the church at Corinth, chapter 9, verses 1 through 19, in an appeal for his credibility as a true apostle of the gospel of Christ, makes the case for the church's responsibility in providing for the livelihood of ministers of the word. We note of verses 7 to 14 especially, which draws from the Old Covenant tithing process. It reads, "Whoever goes to war at his own expense, who plants a vineyard and does not eat of its fruit, or who tends a flock and does not drink of the milk of the flock. Do I say these things as a mere man? Or does not the law say the same also? For it is written in the law of Moses, 'You shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain.' Is it oxen God is concerned about? Or does he say it altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt, this is written, that he who ploughs should plough in hope, and he who threshes in hope should be partaker of his hope. If we have sown spiritual things for you, is it a great thing if we reap your material things? If others are partakers of this right over you, are we not even more? Nevertheless, we have not used this right, but endure all things lest we hinder the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who minister the holy things eat of the things of the temple, and those who serve at the altar partake of the offerings of the altar? Even so, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel." He goes on, however, despite what should be provided for him, to say, "But I have used none of these things, nor have I written these things that it should be done so to me. For it would be better for me to die than that anyone should make my boasting void. For if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of, for necessity is laid upon me. Yes, woe is me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this willingly, I have a reward. But if against my will, I have been entrusted with a stewardship. What is my reward then? that when I preach the gospel, I may present the gospel of Christ without charge, that I may not abuse my authority in the gospel. For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win them all. Paul was able to support himself, at least for a season of his apostolic ministry, through his trade as a tent maker, shown explicitly in Acts chapter 18 verse 3, and implicitly in Acts chapter 20 verse 34. But at least 3 other occasions highlight what the responsibility of the body of Christ really ought to be with respect to providing for those who labour as gospel ministers. In Galatians chapter 6 verse 6 he writes, "Let him who is taught the word share in all good things with him who teaches." And in Philippians chapter 4 verses 10 through 20, Paul praises the church at Philippi, saying, "But I rejoiced in the Lord greatly, that now at last your care for me has flourished again, though you surely did care, but you lacked opportunity. Not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. I know how to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Nevertheless, you have done well that you shared in my distress. Now you Philippians know also that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia, no church shared with me concerning giving and receiving, but you only. For even in Thessalonica, you sent aid once and again for my necessities. Not that I seek the gift, but I seek the fruit that abounds to your account. Indeed, I have all and abound. I am full, having received from Epaphroditus the things sent from you, a sweet-smelling aroma, an acceptable sacrifice, well-pleasing to God. And my God shall supply all your need according to his riches in glory by Christ Jesus." The sacrifice and account credit elements here clearly reflect that of the Old Testament tithe brought to the priests at Jerusalem, which were given in obedience to God, but also used by the priests ministering on their behalf. Then in his first letter to Timothy, chapter 5, verses 17 and 18, we read, "Let the elders who rule well be counted worthy of double honour, especially those who labour in the word and doctrine. For the scripture says, 'You shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain,' and 'the labourer is worthy of his wages.'" So, we can see that in a similar way to how Israel's priestly ministers were provided for through the tithe of those to whom they ministered, the body of believers that constitute the church are also taught to provide for those whose lives are set apart for the ministry of the word. Tithing is not stated as the mandated way to achieve this, but it is obvious tithing would be a practical starting point to ensure more than meagre offerings are what full-time vocational ministers can rely on, especially for those who rule well. 2. Providing for fellow believers. Providing for fellow believers' needs in its Old Testament context might be seen in the supply from the tithe every 3rd year for the Levite, the fatherless, and the widow who are within their gates. Echoes of this can be heard in the post-Pentecost context in Acts chapter 2, verse 44, which reads, "Now all who believed were together and had all things in common, and sold their possessions and goods, and divided them among all as anyone had need." Then in Acts chapter 4, verses 32 and 34 to 35, "Now the multitude of those who believed were of one heart and one soul. Neither did anyone say that any of the things he possessed was his own, but they had all things in common. Nor was there anyone among them who lacked, for all who were possessors of lands or houses sold them, and brought the proceeds of the things that were sold, and laid them at the apostles' feet, and they distributed to each as anyone had need." And this is followed by the startling account of Ananias and Sapphira's deaths, after lying about the amount they had earned from their sale when joining in with these offerings. We note of the widows receiving aid in Acts chapter 6 verse 1, being among the disciples constituting the fledgling church. Then in Acts chapter 11 verses 27 through 30, we see that in response to a famine, relief is directed specifically to the brethren dwelling in Judea. Why there seems to be such an in-house believer focus when it comes to provision, apart from the obvious appeal this would have for not yet believers, might remind us of Jesus' words recorded in John chapter 13, verse 35. By this all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. And Paul shows the explicit giving aspect of this love in Galatians, when he states in chapter 6, verse 10, "Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all, especially to those who are of the household of faith." It is also important to point out that it is stipulated that the disciples gave each according to his ability. In other words, something akin to a percentage-based offering like the tithe. The same principle is seen in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 to 3, regarding a collection for the Christians in Jerusalem, where the believers in Corinth are given the injunction to each lay something aside, storing up as he may prosper, before Paul arrives, so he does not have to take up an otherwise potentially smaller, spontaneous offering. The storing up aspect reminds us once again of the third year tithe of Deuteronomy chapter 14 and 26, and could possibly be one of the earliest forms from which is derived what is now the common weekly tithe or giving in the church today. A collection for Jerusalem is mentioned also in Romans chapter 15 verses 26 and 27, showing how giving should be motivated by gratefulness for God's grace. Finally, in his second letter to the church at Corinth, we have in chapter 9, verses 1 through 15, Paul's writing again about a collection for Christians. Out of some concern his boasting of them to the believers at Macedonia would prove premature, he requests for them to be prepared with a generous gift before he arrives, a gift which they had already pledged. Paul emphasizes that this should not be out of religious compulsion, but from their heart of generosity, and which links back to God's intention for the tithe for Israel, a sharing of their common wealth, to be enjoyed together in joyful fellowship with each other and before the Lord. 3. Providing for others. Providing for others' needs, that is, not just believers, is mentioned in the Hebrew scriptures in the context of tithing with its stipulation of the stranger. Concern for the general poor, both materially and spiritually, is replete in the New Testament as well. In terms of explicit post-Pentecost teaching for church congregations, though, we focus on only the following few key passages. Galatians chapter 6, verse 10, in the context of sowing and reaping, reads, "Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all." 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 18b, after warning earlier about the love of money, commands the rich to be ready to give, willing to share. In James chapter 1, verse 27, we read, "Pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their trouble, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world." And 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 3 reminds believers that all of this giving to the poor profits nothing without love. Again, these passages do not specify the giving be something that comes from the tithe, but churches can be vehicles for community aid when sufficient funds enable them, and tithing is a practical way to achieve it. So, in summary, we have seen how tithing in the Old Testament, though binding for the people of Israel, and to be taken seriously, was intended for theirs and others' good. Likewise, in the New Testament, though no longer binding, we saw the same principles of the use of a believer's income taught to Christians, being categorized as 1. Providing for ministers, 2. Providing for fellow believers, and 3. Providing for others. Therefore, if 10% was the baseline in the Old Testament to meet each of these three areas, and God is the same God today, and that the Old Testament still serves to inform our understanding of the New, then it stands to reason that, in a similar way to how the weekly Sabbath holy day rest is still valuable in principle, tithing, too, still stands as another available, valuable principle for Christians to practice, a helpful guide or starting point for regular giving in the collections taken up within any given local Christian community, just so long as indicated in both the Old and New Testaments, that this tithing and giving be motivated out of love for God and love for neighbour.